Who the hell can wait till morning? Talk now at latenightsportsradio.com.
It's the Fantasy Greeks NFL Power Hour, August 3rd edition, 2016, as we are very quickly on the upward spiral. I won't say downward spiral, but upward spiral toward our first taste of preseason NFL action. I am joined once again in the virtual studio here by Jim Saranteas, the Fantasy Greek himself, and Sammy Bissett from thefantasygreek.com. Good afternoon or good evening, gentlemen.
What's going on, Keith?
How are we today?
I can't complain, Sammy. You?
Doing pretty well for now. See how the show goes.
This show is going to make
what could possibly go badly to ruin your day?
I'm always skeptic.
Well, I'm glad somebody else is besides me.
Yeah, right. Love it. So last week, if you missed it, you can catch it on iTunes, on Spreaker, at latenightsportsradio.com. There's links to the Spreaker page to make it easier for you. Last week we talked about the top 10 running backs for this year's fantasy football drafts. And tonight the topic is wide receivers. And we'll go through Jim's top 10, some people that are kind of on the bubble. And then if we have time, we'll get into overrated, underrated. So without further ado, the way this works, kids, is Jim's going to give us the names, and Sammy and myself will give our input on whether we like that person or not. And if you want to call in or ask for any advice, ask a question, have a comment, tell us we stink. The phone number is 585-633-7487, 585-633-7487. Or you can tweet with the hashtag AskTFG, and we will address your issue as soon as possible. All right. Without further delay, Jim, who's number 10 on the old wide receiver list?
I think it's hard to deny him despite sort of an off season that he had last year, and that's T.Y. Hilton for the Indianapolis Colts. The big news is obviously Andrew Luck bouncing back from last season. So far, so good. I suppose we'll know more how he is as the preseason progresses. But at this point, you got to think he's going to come back fully healthy. He basically missed the second half of the season, and despite having less than average quarterbacking under center, T.Y. Hilton still put up roughly 70 receptions, 1,000 yards receiving. The TD totals weren't that great. But last year was supposed to be his breakout year. Looks like it'll be this year, which is why we see him more as a 1,400-yard receiver, 8 to 10 TDs. There's no reason not to consider him as a lower wide receiver one. Certainly plenty of people are in the running for that distinction. But for me, I like T.Y. Hilton among some of the other options that potentially could be there at number 10.
All right. Sammy, what do you think of that?
When I look at T.Y. Hilton and I kind of evaluate the numbers and the offense that he's getting into, I agree with Jim in the assessment. He's kind of a low-end wide receiver one. I actually had him rated right around the 10 to 12 range, and there's just a plethora of wide receivers that are in that same category where you're not quite sure if the injury bug is completely done yet, or they're guys that they just have some type of a deficiency. And the one thing for Hilton, to me, is you talk about the lower touchdown numbers, 7 touchdowns, 5 touchdowns, 7 touchdowns is what he has per season. And I looked at his game-by-game stats, and one of the things I really latch on to when I'm looking for a true number one wide receiver is like target shares. There's quite a few games where he had 7 targets or fewer last season, and a lot of that did have to do with the fact that the Colts offense was just a mess. Looking at it this year, I think he's definitely going to skyrocket to probably 10 to 11 targets a game, which is kind of what you're looking for in a wide receiver one. And I definitely agree that he's going to start eclipsing the 1,314-yard plateau, and hopefully that'll also translate with some more touchdowns. I also like the fact that Dante Moncrief, he's becoming a sleeper pick that's slowly turning into one of the hotter names in fantasy, because this is a wide receiver too on an absolutely stacked offense, and I think Hilton can be the beneficiary all over the field while Moncrief may take a lot of those red zone targets away and draw some double coverage. I really like Hilton to get some of those one-on-one matchups in the shorter to intermediate parts of the field. So I definitely agree he's a lower end wide receiver 1. I'd prefer to have him as a wide receiver 2, but someone's going to reach on this guy in the second round in most drafts. But that's just my take.
Let me just add to that real quickly, Keith. Other things that are going for him, obviously Kobe Fleener moving on, and truly a lack of a running game for the Colts. I mean, Frank Gore is 31, 32, 33 years old, and by no stretch of the imaginations that were his numbers eye-popping, this will be an offense that is pass first.
So now you bring up an interesting point there, Jim. Doesn't the lack of a running game, and I agree with you, it's going to be pass first and pass heavy, but doesn't that kind of take away from that? I mean, defenses know where the Colts are going. I mean, Andrew Luck is Andrew Luck, but he's also missed the entire year due to injury. Doesn't that kind of hurt T.Y. Hilton, having such a one-sided offense?
Not at all. I mean, you throw the football enough times to a person, it's not going to hurt him in fantasy.
Okay. Just wanted to clear the air there, because when I think of teams that are one-sided, it becomes a concern in my head, and I kind of shy away from that person. And, I don't lose sleep over not drafting them, but you're saying T.Y. Hilton should be safe regardless of the one-sided offense. Okay.
Look, I think Hilton is going to be a beneficiary of what a lot of defenses are. They're going to try and cover Moncrief, like I said, in the red zone. And I really think Dwayne Allen is going to be kind of that third option that's poised for a big season. But Hilton, he's just a little bit – he just has too much explosiveness. I like the fact he's one of the smaller types of receivers, but Luck seems to really kind of feed him the ball as much as he can when the game's on the line. And I just don't think this Colts I just really don't think that the Colts are going to be blowing a ton of people out. And I just really think that they can talk all they want about trying to establish the run, but keeping, like Jim said, keeping it pass first and keeping Hilton involved in every single quarter is just going to be the bigger priority. So I'm not too worried about the fact that teams may be trying to load up on his side a little bit more. There's just too many ways to get him the ball.
Well, and the Colts are what they are. Last year they were just as pass-heavy, even with a string of backups as they were with Andrew Luck. So they are what they are. They're not going to change anything. So Hilton should be Hilton. All right, who's number 9?
Well, it's going to be Chargers' Keenan Allen, who's on pace for a spectacular season last year before going down to injury in that Baltimore Ravens game. He safely projects as a 100-yard receiving wide receiver, 1,400 yards, with the potential for double-digit TDs. He is a Phillip Rivers favorite. His skills, I really truly believe, are, with the exception of a few of the guys ahead of him, they are unmatched. And if there's a player that's going to bounce back strong, it's going to be Keenan Allen.
All right, Sammy, thoughts?
Honestly, if it weren't for that injury last season, Keenan Allen might be approaching that top 5 wide receiver category for me. But I think 9's a pretty appropriate grade. I still like the fact that they got Travis Benjamin to kind of stretch the field a little bit, because anytime you look at a Keenan Allen highlight video, you see a lot of those just 3 to 4 yard drags that he can turn into 15, 20 yard gains, just because once he really hits his stride, he's one of the faster wide receivers in the game. He was also averaging 11 targets last year per game before the injury, which kept him in some pretty elite company. As long as he's going to be back at 100%, I'd love to have him as a wide receiver 1. I think there will be a few games like he's had throughout his career or a few weeks where he just kind of frustrates you and isn't completely involved because Phillip Rivers loves to spread the ball around. But I think he's going to be the beneficiary of the new additions with Travis Benjamin, and I think being able to take the top off of a defense is going to have to require defenses to stay on the side opposite Keenan a little bit more. So I really, really like him at 9, and he's a guy I'm going to be targeting kind of in the late 2nd to early 3rd round.
And in 2013, when Whisenhunt was the Chargers offensive coordinator, that was the year he caught 71 balls for over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. So you could probably see more of the same. And last year, even though it was just a half-year sample, his catch percentage was 75%. He caught 3/4 of the balls thrown his way. So he was on pace for a fantastic year. All right, so number 9, Keenan Allen. Number 10 was T.Y. Hilton. Who's number 8?
At number 8, this is a player that, in retrospect, when I look back at the rankings, could arguably be ranked a little bit higher. But I think there's some things that potentially might be going against him this year, and that's DeAndre Hopkins. There's no question he's a stud wide receiver. I had him in a couple of my leagues. People let him drop, I think, into the 4th, 5th round last year. I mean, it was just stupid, and he was just incredible. 111 receptions, 1,521 yards, 11 TDs. The thing that makes me hesitate that he'll top 1,500 again is Brock Osweiler. I know the Texans went out and they arguably got the best free agent quarterback that was available. Arguably got one of the best running backs that was available. It should make their offense better. And plus added a bunch of wide receivers in this offense. But Brock Osweiler had all those things with the Broncos, and it wasn't like Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders suddenly, excelled at playing wide receiver. I mean, their best days were with Peyton Manning under the helm and when Peyton Manning was at his best. So I'm hesitating giving him much higher boost. I think he'll probably go a little bit higher than 8. He'll be in that late 1st round or early 2nd round for certain. And I like him. That's just where I have him ranked for now.
Oh, Sammy, Texans player. You cover the Texans for the Fantasy Greek.
Yeah, and I'm not completely knocking the rank, but I will say this is the lowest I've seen him in pretty much every format. I actually do have one slight hesitation, and it's not Osweiler, because if he can get his numbers with the combination of Ryan Mallett, Brian Hoyer, TJ Yates, I'm pretty sure he could do it with anyone. What concerns me a little bit is the Texans. We're not quite sure how exactly their offense is going to function, because they're talking about incorporating a few new receivers. They're talking about Jalen Strong is really coming along in camp. You got Braxton Miller. The target share is going to be spread a lot thinner. Well, not a whole lot thinner, because he did reel in 192 targets, which was 3rd most. But I think that the key stat that I really picked up on that I thought Hopkins could improve on, and it's not really Hopkins, it's the Texans quarterbacks, is that out of the 192 targets, he only caught 111 balls. So he's only catching 57% of his targets, which is among the lowest of any of those 20 wide receivers of last year. I still think he finishes above double digits for touchdowns. To me, he's more in that 4 to 6 range. So, and I concur with Jim that it's going to be that late 1st round, early 2nd round if you want to get Hopkins.
How much of Hopkins is riding on Osweiler?
Everything. There's everything. I'm not sure who else the Texans have in terms of quarterbacks, but if Osweiler really takes to that new offense, sky's the limit for Hopkins. If he doesn't, I suppose you could argue the best he'll do is what he did last year. But that's why I kind of had to knock him down a little bit. I'm still not sold that Brock Osweiler is all that he is, primarily because he's learning a new offense. But we'll see.
The Texans' backup quarterbacks are Tom Savage and Brandon Weeden as of today.
Look, the only thing I'll finish about Hopkins is that the Texans aren't going to be blowing a lot of teams out. So they're going to be in every single game. They're going to be throwing pretty much every single week. In fact, the lowest amount of targets he had in a single week last year was 6 targets. So you can feel it's a pretty safe bet that he's going to get plenty of opportunities. And I honestly don't know how Osweiler could be any worse than Hoyer. I know the numbers were fairly similar last year, but Osweiler still has upside, and I think he and Hopkins can really establish some rapport early.
And I think some of that quarterback play has to do with that 57% catch percentage too.
Yeah.
So, all right, number 8, DeAndre Hopkins. Jim, who's number 7?
Number 7 is going to be Des Bryant of the Dallas Cowboys. And, the main reason that he's ranked this high is he's just very consistent. He's had over 1,200 yards receiving 3 of his last 4 seasons. His worst season was last year because Tony Romo was out. So, everything, the expectation is Des Bryant's coming back strong. He is their number one offensive weapon next to Ezekiel Elliott. Hopefully he can stay healthy to keep defenses honest. If there's one thing that could hold him back, one thing to get anybody nervous about, that's the health of Tony Romo. Just consider the fact that he's been hurt at least 2 out of the last 3 seasons, a couple of broken collarbones. Now he's complaining of back issues, and it can make you kind of nervous, I think, looking forward. And in fact, with today, it's reported the Cowboys are looking at Nick Foles, which I thought was sort of an eye raiser. There's not too many people that Nick Foles is in the conversation with to be a backup, so that says maybe a little bit about the Cowboys' confidence in their backup quarterbacks. Even though I'm a big fan of Dak Prescott, and I think he'd be a great NFL quarterback when he's ready to be given a shot. In any case, Des Bryant, number 7.
All right, Sammy, Des Bryant thoughts.
So, you see, Dez is going, and I was looking at Fantasy Football Calculator, which kind of projects where they're going in a lot of different sites, and Dez is currently going 6th, as the 6th wide receiver. For me, he's a touchdown machine, and I think we've seen that over the years, that when the Cowboys get to the red zone, they've been looking Dez first. They haven't been looking to run. It's just putting a lot of draft stock early, especially as a late first, early second round pick. These are guys that you need to show up every single week. And Dez, we know that the talent's there. We know that the ability is there. But like you said, Jim, I'm not completely comfortable with a wide receiver in the first round taking a guy that I've got to worry about a couple other factors. And Dez hasn't necessarily been a picture of perfect health. He missed a couple games in each of his first 2 seasons in the foot injury last year. He's a guy that's going to make or break a lot of fantasy teams. If I could get him kind of late second, early third, I know we've been saying a lot about these first 4 guys, but it's just... You love the talent. You love the fact that he thinks he's the best player in the league. I'm just not completely sold that with Elliott, with Morris, and then McFadden when he gets healthy, that Dez is going to have the number of targets we've seen in the past. So I'm penciling him in for around 1,200 to 1,300 yards, and 10 to 12 touchdowns. So it's kind of up to you and how you draft in the first round, whether or not you take a wide receiver early or a running back early, on whether or not that's going to be enough value. But for me, I've got a couple red flags despite the talent.
And just looking at that last season, he was in the 40s, if I read that right, with catch percentage. 43.1, actually, last season. So for Des Bryant's all world though. When he and Romo are healthy,
yeah.
And to address the interest in what's his name, Nick Foles, it's clearly that if there's one thing that you can count on, it's death taxes and a Tony Romo injury. It's, unfortunately, because Romo is one of those quarterbacks that when he's healthy and right, he's capable of a lot of good things. But when he's just seems to be healthy or injured, banged up, nicked up, not always season ending, but need an insurance policy. All right, number 6. Who you got, Jim?
At number 6, we've got the Green Bay Packers' Jordy Nelson with an asterisk by his name. There's no question Jordy Nelson is one of the top wide receivers in this league. He has absolute chemistry with Aaron Rodgers. He can outplay any defensive back. I haven't seen any defensive back that can slow this guy down. He and Aaron Rodgers, they know each other. The big problem is he's having some issues getting back on the field right now. So it's possible when your draft rolls around, this might be a guy you might just kind of say, let me pass on him and see if he's going to be around to be my second wide receiver. The most recent reports have him sitting because of knee tendonitis. Now, whether or not that's related necessarily with his previous injury, something separate, I'm not too sure about that. But it's his health that's the big issue. Otherwise, he if he's healthy, he's a top 5 talent.
All right, Sammy.
And this is another, it's just a common theme. It's one of these guys that we know is a top 5 talent that, once again, there's just one or two major question marks. But for Nelson, it's just so hard to ignore the years he had with Rodgers before last year and just how talented he was. It's just every part of the field he was getting the ball. And I don't think anyone expected out of college that he would be as strong as a deep threat as he's become. But if the reports are true and it turns out that he's going to probably miss a few preseason games, he may not even suit up for a preseason game, but he can get back at 100%. This is a guy that I think is going to go in the middle of the second round in almost every single draft, if not a little bit higher. Last year, honestly, and it was brutal watching the Packers. Like, as a guy who jumped on the Randall Cobb bandwagon, Jordy really is the true number 1 wide receiver in Green Bay. There is really no doubt about that. And they really, really are going to be dependent on him to come back if they're going to once again become a contender. I'm projecting him right now at 100%. He's going to be around 85 to 90 catches. And I think he'll get back to that double-digit touchdown total that we're accustomed to seeing from him. But again, it's going to be something that you're going to have to monitor almost every single day, because if he's not 100%, I think a lot of the other Packers as well are going to struggle a little bit this fantasy season.
Especially since the early reports of Devontae Adams dropping everything within his reach.
Yep.
But Jordy Nelson, being 31 and having the injury last year and now having knee tendonitis, giant question mark. He's another one that I wouldn't lose any sleep over if I end up not getting him. But like you said, you got that memories in your head of him and Aaron Rodgers tearing the world up, and it's easy to go after that name, but Father Time may be catching up with another one. All right, number 5. Who you got, Jim?
Undeniably seasoned veteran, go-to guy. His value was all based on the return of Ryan Fitzpatrick, and that's the Jets' Brandon Marshall. Every season you always get naysayers that talk about Brandon Marshall not having a good season. I don't think there's any reason to believe that this year with Fitzpatrick back. But he's one of these guys that can easily haul in 100 yards receiving, 1,500 yards, double-digit TDs, no questions asked. And, I think that actually having more Matt Forte on the field will help him. Matt Forte compared to Chris Ivory and Bilal Powell is just he's a force, and he's in good health and he's in great shape. So I still like Brandon Marshall, and certainly in PPR leagues he's going to be a stud.
Sammy?
We saw last year that Marshall ended up top 5 in terms of PPR ratings, and I kind of felt like his season was relatively quiet. He came away with over 1,500 yards and 109 receptions, but all everyone talked about was kind of the Jets' collapse at the very end of the season. But one thing that you can count on is Brandon Marshall putting up points every single week. His 14 TDs last year, to me, that's a little bit high than what I'm expecting this year, but I still think it's going to be, again, like you want out of every top 5 wide receiver. He's going to be approaching 10-plus touchdowns this year. And I completely agree with Jim. That's something that I wrote in my notes, that the addition of Matt Forte and Bilal Powell coming out of the backfield, that's going to force a lot of defenses to have to cheat up and have to make arrangements to stop those guys in the passing game as well, which is going to give Marshall some more one-on-one opportunities. And I think what we saw in year 1 with Fitzpatrick was almost as good of a start as you can have for the first year with a combination like that. But I actually think that they can even step it up a little bit more. Very quietly, I think the Jets have pretty much transitioned to become a pass-first offense, in my opinion, as well. So he's also got that going for him.
Yeah, last year the Jets were 57% pass, which kind of blows my mind when you think about Ryan Fitzpatrick, but it's Chan Gailey. And I agree with both of you. Matt Forte is just going to open up that defense. If there's one player who will go from good to great, I believe it will be Brandon Marshall. And he's enjoy your one last season with him before he gets too old. Just kidding. Who's number 4, Jim?
An improbable player last season, somebody that came out of nowhere, going into his 3rd season as a pro, the Jaguars' Allen Robinson, who just blew up the gridiron last year, as did Blake Bortles and Allen Hurns. He's just an incredible talent, and he's a go-to player in that offense now. I don't see things changing too much. I know they added Chris Ivory, who will give them a little bit more of a running attack. Everybody's expecting their defense to be better, and you can't let the genie out of the bag now that the genie's out. He's just an incredible talent, and I think we have not heard the end of this kid, and expect similar numbers to last season, if not slightly better.
Sammy?
And I've got Allen Robinson just a little bit below him, or below that top 5 tier. However, it's in the exact same category that a lot of these receivers that have. It's the Jordy Nelsons, it's the Des Bryants, guys that you're not 100% sure if they're going to really perform to a top 5 level. I've got no doubt that I think Allen Robinson, out of that group of kind of guys you're going to have to spend a 1st or 2nd round pick on, I think he's the safest bet to stay in the top 10 for wide receivers every year. I'm not incredibly high on Bortles, but I will tell you one thing, that I think Robinson is going to be able to sustain a lot of the same numbers in terms of double-digit touchdowns. I think he caught 80 balls last year for a solid 1,400, which is great for radio and TV, that you don't have to worry about 1,402 yards and all that. Anyways, the number one thing with Robinson for me is that I also think Allen Hurns takes a step back. And I don't think we're going to be seeing as many touchdowns from him, because, he ended up catching a ton of touchdowns, but he was still 33rd in receptions, which kind of tells you that he had an abnormally high touchdown rate for a number 2 wide receiver. So I think there's going to be more opportunities for Robinson this year. I think the Jaguars want to balance it a little bit, but I think Robinson's clearly one of the best receivers in the league going forward, and I think he's definitely got even top 3 potential this year.
Well, last year, Bortles averaged almost 38 passing attempts per game. That's just chucking the ball, and a lot of it had to do with them, being on the wrong end of the scoreboard for a lot of those games. They were 5-11 last year. But if things go well, my only concern with Allen Robinson is that I kind of like what the Jaguars did on defense in the offseason. So if games are closer and they have more of an opportunity to run the ball, but I'll worry about that when it actually happens. Allen Robinson, I think, is poised for a big year. Number 3, Jim, who you got?
Number 3, number 2 are pretty much, to me, a tie. And I think in PPR leagues, it's easier to go with one over the other. But right now at number 3, I've got Odell Beckham Jr. And right next to him, Julio Jones. We could just talk about these 2 guys together. Odell Beckham Jr., there's no question he's a stud. 96 receptions, 158 targets, 1,450 yards, 13 TDs. The only addition that they made was they added a good rookie wide receiver in Sterling Shepard, who should actually help take the heat off of Odell Beckham, as well as hopefully Victor Cruz can at least play at a level that takes some more heat off Odell Beckham Jr. So those sorts of things point him to even being better than the number 3 and possibly pushing to be the number 2 at the end of the season. It's a pass-first offense. There's nothing about the Giants' running game that makes you think, they're going to run more. They really didn't make any substantial additions. Rashard Jennings could actually have a little bit better season in this offense after a second year under his belt, but this is still the Odell Beckham show. I'm interested to see how he handles Norman Johnson, since last year we saw them play once. Is sort of the NFL, the way they do their schedules this year, and I'm assuming the next few seasons he's going to get Josh Norman twice a year. So we'll see how that matchup plays itself out. But it's Odell Beckham, and then Julio Jones is right there. He's a better PPR guy because of the number of receptions he gets. the Falcons really made no effort to really change up that offense. I mean, Mohamed Sanu was their big addition, and it wasn't exactly like he blew up the Bengals offense when he was there. He might be a slight upgrade over Roddy White, but it's not much. So Julio Jones will still be the number one guy in that offense.
All right, Sammy.
Yeah, and with Odell at number 3, he's a big reason why I'm also loving Eli Manning this year. Yeah. And I kind of think he's going to be an underrated fantasy quarterback because of Beckham. And it was interesting because when I was looking at the targets from last year, Odell, even though he finished in the top 3 for most leagues in terms of points, he wasn't even top 5. He was the 7th most targeted wide receiver in the league last year. He was sitting at 10.5 per game, which is a little bit surprising because you think with how great of a season he had that it could have been even better if he didn't miss that Week 16 game at Minnesota. I mean, he really didn't have – he had 2 or 3 games where it just kind of wasn't wide receiver 1 status. But he's the type of guy that he's going to get 10-plus touchdowns easy. He's also going to get it in multiple games because they're looking at him from all areas of the field. He's another reason why I also think that the rookie Sterling Shepard is going to have a great season, but they're both similar in that Odell could line up outside just as well as he can line up in the slot. I think he'll be a little bit closer to 180 to 190 targets instead of the 160 last year, which, I mean, realistically could put him in the talk as the number 1 wide receiver going in drafts this year. But three is where I have him ranked as well. And I just think that the Giants, we talk about what Atlanta did, the Giants really didn't do a whole lot to shore up their running game. I mean, they're going with the same cast of characters except for Paul Perkins that they picked up in the draft. I just see this being a team that's similar to the Jets. They want to be a little bit more balanced, but they're going to be thrown at 30 to 40 times every single week just because I don't think their running game can get it done, which is just better news for Odell going forward.
Yeah, for what it's worth, and I know it's the first week of August here, but Victor Cruz is like 5th on the depth chart right now.
Yeah,
at ourlads.com. So how much he factors into this, if he is able to be even a fraction of what he was, then you've got him. If Shepard's what we all think he will be, couple that with Beckham, you've got defenses really scrambling in a nickel and a dime package trying to match up. You can really screw with defenses' heads if you have a talented wide receiver core like that. And Rashad Jennings is not a bum if they choose to run the ball. He should be. It all falls on that offensive line, and there's not a whole lot. There's no changes on that offensive line from last year, but we shall see. If you're worried about the new head coach was the offensive coordinator last season, so it's pretty much going to be the same exact offense that you saw last year. And with Julio Jones, I mean, it's year 2 of the Falcons coach. Help me out here. I'm blanking out. Bad time to have a brain fart.
Then you shouldn't have mentioned it.
You're right. You are absolutely right.
Lessons learned. I'll tell you in 1 second, Keith. It's Dan Quinn.
Thank you. All I wanted to say was Gus Bradley. I'm like, no, he was the other Seahawks defensive coordinator that went to Jacksonville. Second year of Dan Quinn. Kyle Shanahan returns, offensive coordinator. Matt Ryan was not the Matt Ryan we expected last year, but it's first year in a somewhat new offense to him. Mohamed Sanu comes over to play opposite him, kind of stepping into the Roddy White role, but it's not going to be Roddy White. But Roddy White wasn't Roddy White last year either. So if any kind of upgrade as to what on top of whatever White gave them last year, just bodes even better for Julio. All right, that leads up to this magic moment. Number 1, Jim.
Well, the number 1 guy, hands down, across the board, anywhere you look, it's going to be Antonio Brown of the Pittsburgh Steelers.
I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, didn't see it either. 136 passes for over 1,800 yards, 10 touchdowns. I mean, expect similar numbers. I mean, if he's off 100 yards, don't cry about it. He'll still be great. And in fact, there's some things that lend themselves to suggest that he'll even be better. With Le'Veon Bell going to be out, possibly out 4 games. D'Angelo Williams doesn't really factor into the passing game at all. Marcus Wheaton, despite Martavis Bryant being gone, Marcus Wheaton has yet to really step up in the offense. And even though there's been some positive reports of Sammy Coates so far in the preseason, it's quite a big jump. It's quite a lot to ask of a second-year wide receiver like Sammy Coates, who I think played in one game and had one reception the entire season. So it's going to be Antonio Brown, and they can double-team him, triple-team him. He's going to get the football. He's going to get yards. He's going to score.
Sammy?
Yeah, and I've heard people try and make the argument that it's going to be Julio Jones as number one this year. I'm just not seeing it. Brown was my number one guy before Bryant's suspension. He was my number one guy after Bell's suspension. I mean, there's just no denying his talent. He was actually second in targets last year behind Jones with 12 targets a game. Julio just barely managed 12.7 targets a game to lead everybody. It's one of those deals where it almost feels like he's in a similar situation to Jones in the fact that he will, without a doubt, regardless of how the offense performs, he's going to be the number one option on that offense, and he's going to be force-fed the ball. Although I do think that'll make it easier for defenses to kind of prepare and prevent some of those deeper balls that Brown's so accustomed to making big plays with. I've really loved what they've done in terms of being able to move him around on the field. It's a pretty creative offense, and that's why they're considered a top 3 offense the last couple of years in terms of getting the ball into his hands. And the number one thing that kind of cut the cord with Julio that we didn't really talk about is the fact out of the 5 seasons and he's been pretty dominant, but Jones has only gotten 10 touchdowns one time. I mean, last year was 8, the year before it was 6, and he's putting up all these receptions and getting these great yardage totals. Well, Brown does that, and he's also going to approach double-digit, or he's going to exceed double-digit touchdowns. So, I hear a lot of the chatter that you can make a case for 1 or 2, but I think Brown at only 5'10", he's shown he can go up and get the ball from pretty much anywhere. He can turn a 2-yard drag route into an 80-yard touchdown. I mean, and he even gives you a little bit in the return game as well. I mean, he's just so dangerous from all over the field, and I just don't see any way he doesn't finish inside the top 2 or 3 at worst, which is exactly what you're looking for in a number 1 or number 2 overall pick.
Yep, it's Antonio Brown is what it is really at this point. You guys gave all the points. There's nothing I can add to it, really. Roethlisberger is Roethlisberger. As long as he's healthy, Antonio will be the guy. Marcus Wheaton, as an owner of Marcus Wheaton, I hope he catches on and figures it out. But, Sammy Coates, to answer your question, Jim, he actually appeared in 7 games, but did only catch 1 ball for 11 yards.
So I was half right.
You're half right. But the arrow is pointed up, right, Sammy? Right? Okay.
Well, and here's something else to consider. Brandon Marshall threw down the gauntlet a little bit, placing that car on the market to say he would have a better season than Antonio Brown. And I kind of love the competitiveness from Marshall. But Antonio Brown, I mean, he's kind of a joker and all this stuff. He's one of the most competitive players on the planet. I mean, he just has a nerve and just a desire to be great. And it's just one of those deals where we're going to look back 3 or 4 years from now and realize that Brown may actually throw himself into that area as one of the top receivers of this decade, and eventually maybe even a Hall of Famer. And I think that's something that he genuinely wants that a lot of these other receivers just really can't measure up to. I mean, I love the guy. I can't think of a flaw in his game, really, except the fact he's not 6'3", but he still has the leaping ability and the red zone potential to get you just what the guys like Allen Robertson and Odell Beckham can get you.
All right, so there you have it, our top 10 wide receivers in order. Number 1, Antonio Brown, then Julio Jones and Odell Beckham is a tie at 2nd and 3rd. Allen Robinson, Brandon Marshall, then Jordy Nelson. At 7, Des Bryant, then DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, and number 10, T.Y. Hilton, rounding out the top 10. Jim, there's some notable names there that didn't make the top 10 this year that we've been accustomed to seeing. One that immediately jumps out to me is A.J. Green. Can you tell us why he's not in the top 10?
Yeah, sure. The primary reason that I hesitate in putting A.J. Green in that top 10 is the inconsistency of the Bengals' passing offense. If you've had him on your fantasy team, you know exactly what I'm talking about. He's not one of the aforementioned 10 that we talked about that you can sort of rely on to get some combination of 100 yards or 100 yards in a TD, week in, week out. A.J. Green's performance is largely going to be dependent upon Andy Dalton's performance, and that's what holds Andy Dalton back, is he's not a regular QB1. He just hasn't done that. And these guys have been in the league now, I think, 4 or 5 years, and, it's a trend, it's a pattern, it's a thing that you just can't deny. Could he put up 1,400 yards and double-digit TDs? Absolutely, no question, he could. He's got some things going for him, and the biggest one is, he's the number one receiver on a team that is lacking receiving compliments around him. For example, Tyler Eifert, he's hurt. It's highly questionable whether he'll play week 1. Today, Tyler Kroft was injured, and now his status is up in the air. He's actually going to be undergoing an MRI tomorrow. I do like Tyler Boyd. I think Tyler Boyd, as a rookie, is outstanding. Extremely talented. He's going to He's going to add a dimension to this offense that will be amazing. But again, it's the pros. The step up. It's a big step up. One guy I do like is Brandon LaFell. This could be a potential. I know a lot of guys that love Brandon LaFell based on what they remember about him from college, but he's never quite done it. Maybe he could this year. Maybe he could be a good guy, but you don't have to spend a top pick on him. You can go get him in the latter rounds of your fantasy draft and not have to risk a lot. But A.J. Green, despite that, this will still be a run-first offense. They're going to run the football a ton. And that's why I hesitate putting up in the top 10. But give me a break. He's number 11, number 12, okay?
I didn't mean to sound like I was busting chops or anything.
No, because he was one of, when my rankings originally came out, hey, where's A.J. Green? And part of being good in fantasy, a good fantasy player, is not just a guy who goes out there and, every other game puts up monster numbers. You want a guy that goes out there and consistently puts up fantasy relevant numbers. And on the fantasygreek.com, we call that a QFG rating, quality fantasy game ratings. You can find it on our fantasy draft board if you want to check out what players who finished there. But you look at the top 50 guys in that rating board, and those are the must-haves. And A.J. Green is towards the bottom of that top 50. He's not at the top because he's just not stringing those kinds of games together. Cam Newton was a great quarterback last year, one of the top fantasy point go-getter. But Tom Brady, from a fantasy perspective, was probably better because he had more quality fantasy games than Cam Newton. Not a bunch, but he still had more. And you probably won your fantasy championship with Tom Brady as opposed to Cam Newton.
Oh, so the points, the what's the word I'm looking for? Quality over quantity, meaning that the big burst, the heavy point days, greatly are in the minority.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So even looking at these top 10, one of the troubling things, and Sam did a good job pointing this out, is outside of the top 3 guys, everybody sort of has some question marks. However, there are also guys that should be getting you these quality fantasy games. As long as they're healthy, there's no outstanding issues in terms of their quarterback. They should, if they play 16 games, you're hoping they get 12 to 14 are this 100-yard receiving or 100 yards in a TD, which is all you can really ask for. And if you get enough of those players on your roster, your team will win the championship, period.
All right, what about a guy like Demaryius Thomas?
And Sam, you might have a different perspective of this. I am going to avoid drafting Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders unless they really fall in drafts, which I doubt. I just do not like the quarterback situation in Denver. There is nothing about Mark Sanchez or any of the young quarterbacks that gives me the confidence that Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders will be these quality fantasy players that I was just describing. as opposed to players that, yeah, they might have 3, 4, 5 good fantasy games, but the rest of them are going to be ho-hum. You don't want guys like that on your fantasy team, which is why I'd rather let them fall in drafts.
And my issue primarily with Thomas, and trust me, I took quite a lot of pride in being the first on both the Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders bandwagons in back-to-back years. I take great pride in that. I'm completely off the Demaryius Thomas train this year, and a lot of it had to do with the fact he just kind of checked out, especially in the postseason. It was absolutely terrible. He had 7 receptions on 21 targets, and he only had 60 yards through 3 postseason games. Now, you can point to the quarterback issue if you want. There's just no reason why a guy that has this much athleticism and star power should be putting up numbers like that. It's pretty terrible, actually. But like you said, he also had a 1-for-13 game against New England in the overtime game where he caught 1 ball and 13 targets. There's just times where it looks like he completely shuts down, that he's disinterested. And it's one of those deals where you're going to have to, there's someone that's going to gamble on him in the second round that's going to look at him as, oh, this is Demaryius Thomas. He's put up big years before. Last year was just kind of a fluke. Well, the quarterback situation got worse. The defense isn't necessarily all that much better. And you're going in with a guy who has kind of put up a subpar year, and he had an absolutely terrible start or a terrible ending to the year before. I'm honestly not touching Thomas until the 4th round. I mean, you can take the gamble if you want. If he pans out, great for you. But I'm looking at other guys like Brandon Cooks. I'm looking at Alshon Jeffrey, Mike Evans. AJ Green's a top 10 wide receiver. I mean, I know he wasn't great last year, but he just, even though he had as many ups and downs as he did, he still finished 8th. And he hasn't, I mean, with Thomas, like you said, he's going to leave you disappointed more weeks than he will getting you a W, especially if he's your wide receiver 1 or even a wide receiver 2. It's still too much of a gamble for me.
See, even at the 4th round, that's too early for me. I mean, I'm talking 5th, 6th, 7th. I mean, everybody just finally, says, yeah, this guy's not going to pan out and abandons ship, which is what I really think people should do at this point. There is nothing about that Broncos offense except for the running back situation that gets me very excited. And, I'm checking here to see where his average draft position is, and it's early 3rd round.
Yeah, no thanks.
That's way too. I'd rather, looking at the guys being drafted behind him, I'd rather have Sammy Watkins, who actually is higher, should be higher ranked, and is to me a top 16 guy. I think he's returning to practice, I think, tomorrow. So he's actually rehabbing a lot quicker than people expected. I'd rather have Jarvis Landry. Golden Tate, I can't even believe people are nabbing him late in the 4th round. That is just, Golden Tate should be one of these top guys. Calvin Johnson is gone. There is no adequate number 2 there for the Detroit Lions or a surefire guy. I mean, I know Marvin Jones is there. They had Anquan Bolden. I don't necessarily think that those 2 guys will take away from Golden Tate, who's been with the team longer. In fact, I think they will help Golden Tate be more open, because at least a guy like Anquan Bolden will command some coverage because he's just such a talented receiver even at his age. So in other words, there's plenty of other guys. Oh, Jeremy Maclin, top of the 5th round. I'd rather have Jeremy Maclin than Demaryius Thomas.
And I want to say one more thing about Tate, because when Calvin Johnson was injured, he stepped into that number 1 role, and he made the most of his targets. In fact, he was top 10 in several weeks when he was the primary receiver. And I'm just kind of looking at the board. I mean, the fact he's going in the 4th round is about where I take him. But I've seen him fall as far as like the 6th round, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And we're talking about guys in the 2nd and 3rd round, or 2nd and 3rd kind of tier receivers that are either really good and have some slight deficiencies where they won't get you as many touchdowns or they won't get you as many catches, or these guys that have superior talent but just can't piece it all together like AJ Green all of the time. With Demaryius, it was one of those situations where you almost wish it was an injury issue, or you almost wish it was something that you could put your finger on. He's just a guy that I'm staying away from. I just don't see the fire. I just don't. His involvement in the offense, they try to get him the ball as much as possible. He is actually one of the top 5 guys in terms of, he had 11.1 targets a game, and he just posted some pretty pedestrian numbers for that amount of target usage. So I still kind of like Emmanuel Sanders this year. I think they just find creative ways to get him the ball short and deep. He can kind of do it from all areas of the field, but like Jim said, there's just a lot of guys I prefer. Even Jordan Matthews, I would probably take a shot on before Demaryius Thomas this year.
Dante Moncrief, I'd take him.
Yeah.
Take this for what it is, but usually, at least especially the opening weeks of training camp, a head coach tries to take the politically correct, supportive standpoint or orientation. And today, Kubiak just came out and said he's really not happy with the quarterbacks. From day one. We all knew what it was going to be, but to have the coach,
but it's not much of a surprise,
No, but usually you expect the coach to not come out and just say it like that, especially right at the beginning of training camp. So if he's saying it right at the beginning, it's that bad. And who's the third stringer that everyone's saying has got an outside chance to start?
Paxton Lynch, Trevor Siemian.
That was the one.
Yeah. Simeon's a great sleeper, but
Simeon's too, actually, on the depth chart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's just, the question is, are there going to be better fantasy quarterbacks than him? And the answer is yes.
Right.
But in terms of just sort of saying, hey, who's a player that could surprise this year? He's one. And I'm not sold on the idea that Paxton Lynch will not play this year. I think we'll see him towards the end of the season. I think he's that good of a quarterback to be given a shot.
All right, what about a guy like Alshon Jeffrey? He's not in your top 10.
He's not, and he's borderline. I like Alshon Jeffrey. I think he's a great wide receiver. He's had health issues two of his 4 seasons as a pro, so that's a concern. And the other concern is Jay Cutler. If he can stay healthy, I think Alshon Jeffrey could legitimately finish top 10, no question. But I just have him right outside the top 10.
And one of the things about Jeffrey, and this is getting maybe a little bit too in depth, and this is kind of why it's nice to have someone with a medical background to kind of explain some of the weird injuries, the fluky injuries. With Jeffrey, a lot of what I was reading on when I was looking at some injury reports, so much of his issues seem to be like muscle and tissue issue. It's not like the Des Bryant. It's not the broken foot or it's not the ACL. It's just these minor issues that a lot of wide receivers seem to be able to power through. And it's something that I guess Jeffrey, even in college, he kind of struggled with at South Carolina. And it's one of those deals where, yes, he's a big, bruising wide receiver who's going to win a lot of jump balls. He should be a red zone target like he was in 2014. I'm not completely convinced that I want to spend a second or a third round pick, which is where he's going, on a guy that could potentially play to a wide receiver 1 level. But at the same time, just like last year, he could also be one of those guys who's sitting on your bench due to injury or just due to poor play. And I think this is where you really have to go ahead and do a mock draft or kind of study the draft positions and kind of get a feel for who's going way too early, who are some sleepers like the Golden Tates, like the Brandon Cooks, guys that you can get in the 3rd or the 4th round that have wide receiver 1 potential and that don't have as many flaws as Jeffrey has shown early in his career.
Here's my take on Alshon Jeffrey. And if you grew up in the 90s, if you grew up in the 90s, you're going to get this analogy. And if you didn't, you're going to just probably go, huh? He's more Elvin Harper than Michael Irvin. He's a good compliment. When he complimented Brandon Marshall, he tore the world up.
Yep.
And yeah, you're right, absolutely right. He's got to stay healthy, and those nature of those injuries is kind of reason to give pause. But even if he comes back, I mean, I stand by my prediction of last season that I made that by week 6, Kevin White's going to be the go-to target on deep balls. So that's just my off-the-cusp kind of shoot from the hip. What about Brandon Cooks, Jim? Where do you see? He had a pretty decent year, and we all know New Orleans likes to throw the ball.
Yeah, I mean, Brandon Cooks is, his and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but he's good because he's fast, and which means he gets yards after the catch. And players like that, I don't see him putting up 1,800 yards. I see his ceiling to be lower. I like the idea that the Saints added Kobe Fleener. I like the idea that they added Michael Thomas from Ohio State. Mark Ingram is going to be back healthy. Mark Ingram was having a tremendous season before he was injured, and is, to me, easily a running back too, and a guy that could surprise some people if he can stay healthy. So I like Cooks, but I don't. He doesn't get to that wide receiver one for me, just because I think his upside can be limited.
The last 4 games of the season, Cooks' receiving yards were 104, 124, 123, and 29, not necessarily in that order, with 3 touchdowns. And I'm reading off of NFL.com. Over the season's final 9 games, Cooks hauled in 8 touchdowns and 4 games with 100 yards from scrimmage total. So he started out slow, but by the end he was a beast.
Yeah, and he won me one of my leagues, if we're going to be completely honest. One of the things about Cooks that I think also he's got going for him is, like you talked about with Michael Thomas, those are big guys that are going to command a little bit more attention, and those are guys that are going to be kind of looked at as some downfield threats, which gives Cooks, and like we talked about, he's the same type of player as a T.Y. Hilton or a Julian Edelman, guys that they kind of look to get the ball in space and in those short to intermediate routes. That's why I love him in a PPR format a little bit more than standard. But with Cooks, I think something to also note is that he's going into his 3rd year, which is typically a big breakout year for a lot of receivers. So I don't think 1,300, 1,400 yards and close to 10 touchdowns is out of the realm of possibility. But to me, that's his ceiling, which puts him as a pretty good wide receiver 1, but he could just as well finish somewhere with 70 receptions and only 900 yards, which kind of puts you in that wide receiver 2 or 3 category. So it's one of those deals where you're going to have to really build your roster depending on your PPR format or your standard format, and kind of look at Cooks and say he might be a 3rd round value as a PPR player, but maybe only a 4th or 5th rounder in the standard leagues.
And just if this helps, I'm trying to find his QFG rating in PPR leagues, but in non-PPR he's at 47%, which I don't think it puts him in the top 50. Certainly, if he did well at the end of the season, that's what saved him from having just a terrible rating. But in PPR leagues, I'm not seeing it. I don't even see him in the top 100. So, we're sort of splitting hairs a little bit here. He's a good receiver, and the question is whether you see him having more upside than whoever the next ranked player is next to him. And I think that's where you've got to make the call.
All right, we got about 90 seconds left. But one thing I want to ask you about, Amari Cooper.
Yep.
Now, NFL.com, his average draft pick is the 27th, almost 28th pick overall. That seems really low, or like late in the draft for a guy that had a pretty decent season last year.
That's 3rd round in a 12-team league. I mean, I hear a lot of people really high on the Raiders in several respects, but I look at the team, and in whatever step they take forward offensively, it's going to be because of their talent, because they've made no additions on offense except for the offensive line. They made a couple of additions. We'll have to see if they gel. To me, Amari Cooper's a wide receiver too. I think he's another player that suffered a little bit down the stretch of the last season. I think genuinely because he was just tired.
Sammy, 30 seconds.
Honestly, I think he's really going to improve on his percentage in terms of 72 receptions to 130 targets. I am a little bit worried that Derek Carr might kind of have plateaued as an above average quarterback. But I really kind of think that Amari Cooper, this could be the year that he takes that next step into that kind of top 15, top 10 range. So he's definitely a guy to keep out on the lookout for in the 3rd or 4th round.
All right, and with that, we are out of time for this edition of the NFL Power Hour, powered by thefantasygreek.com. Tune in every Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time throughout the football season. For Jim Saranteas and Sammy Bissett from the Fantasy Greek, I'm Keith Grieve. Good luck and good night.